going pretty. Thank you, Ariane. We're going to get going now. So I'm going to have Michael introduce what this whole series is about. So Michael Pearson, are you available?
I am. So, thank you all. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Ralph. What this series is about is really an offer for faculty development beyond the traditional, beyond the normal. At least at the time when I sort of grew up, we didn't have mentors at that level. So thank you, Sandra, for bringing in those mentors.
So as some of you may remember, I wrote a book called Intellectual Shamans, and a shaman is a connector, a sense maker, and a healer, someone who wants to heal the world. And I'm really pleased today to introduce Ralph Hamann, who is from the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business, to guide our discussion. And I'm going to suggest that anybody has questions, please put them in the chat. We'll keep track of them and call on you at the end after Ralph finishes his presentation to be able to ask your questions in person to Ralph. He is his research and teaching are on strategy and sustainability, social innovation and entrepreneurship, and cross-sector collaboration. So sort of all the areas that are boundary spanning for many of us. And among his other roles, he's co-founder and director of the Embedding Project South Africa and the Southern Africa Food Lab, where he's worked for like 16 years. And we'll be reflecting on some of that lessons that he's learned over these years as he takes the kind of risks and adapts to intellectual challenges that intellectual shamans often do. So Ralph, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael and Sandra, for this invitation and this opportunity to have this conversation. It's wonderful to see some old friends on in the call and a whole bunch of wonderful and interesting people. So I will go ahead and share some slides that will structure some of my inputs, and I'm going to try to keep that quite quick so that we can have a conversation as soon as possible, and really am keen to hear from you whatever impressions or reflections or questions you might have. And yeah, let me just kick off here. So I'm going to speak to this paper that came out not that long ago, and it really is a reflection on what we learned over about 15 years as researchers trying to convene multi-stakeholder dialogue on the issue of food insecurity, hunger, malnutrition in South Africa and to some extent the Southern African region. And what I'd like to try to do in the next half an hour or so is just give a little bit of the backstory and the context of the food lab, how it emerged, and then some of the key points in the paper. I'm not going to assume that you had a chance to look at it, so I think it might be worthwhile just to share some of the key arguments. But what I'm particularly interested in some ways, a little bit trepidatious about, is to kind of also connect that work that's that culminated in this paper, and of course the food lab is ongoing, so we keep ourselves busy with it. But I want to connect it with some other work and inspiration that has been more recent for me, and that has to do with shamanism, not in the metaphorical sense, in that Sandra has used it in her wonderful book, but actually in the real sense, in the sense of indigenous knowledge developed and used and applied by shamans. So I know that might be a little bit unusual, but I think this is a crowd where I can try to do this, and I'm really keen to see what happens. It could be like really weird, it could be whatever. I'm quite curious to see what happens. So what I'm going to start with is just a little bit of the backstory and the history. And I'm going to start with a moment in time where I was, in fact, I'm not a food system or nutrition researcher. You know, like most people on the call, I'm in a kind of a, kind of organization studies field. And I was interested in this issue of co-opetition. When do competitors collaborate in the public interest? And so I did a bunch of interviews with a range of people, including a corporate affairs director of a large South African retailer. And this moment is really still very kind of present in my mind. I remember asking her that question, and she didn't blink even for a moment. She turned around on her kind of swivel chair, picked up this big folder of newspaper clippings, and quite dramatically, like in a kind of a Hollywood movie, she threw these newspaper clippings over the table, and they were basically, newspaper clippings like this, which were about the rising food prices at the time and the kind of social protests and riots and all kinds of disruptions which were happening. And apart from the fact that many households were suffering and struggling to feed their families. And what we also learned, but I was actually in a geography department at the time, so my colleagues and friends were involved in research on this topic, and they found that despite the fact that, in those days we still had an assumption, or many of us at least had an assumption, that food insecurity was especially prominent in rural and very poor rural areas, this was a very salient and disturbing issue in our urban areas, literally on our doorsteps, right? So they found in this one survey that 8 out of 10 people in some of these poor communities were severely food insecure. And so this was the kind of impetus of this came from I suppose a moral concern and a kind of empathetic concern that we just had to do something about that. So we went and did a bit of research and try to understand, well, what is the role of business? And also, is there some kind of scope of cross-sector collaboration to address this food insecurity problem? This was published in a development journal, which was, I suppose an easy target. I wasn't in a management school at that stage, as I mentioned. But it gave us some useful ideas, and it basically confirmed to us that there was some scope, some need, and I think some appetite among stakeholders to engage with each other to address this problem. But nobody was doing that. Well, nobody was bringing them together in any kind of structured way. So we looked around and we found things like the Sustainable Food Lab, which many of you might know. Hal Hamilton was really a driving force there, and Peter Singer had some involvement. So people that you probably know quite well. And so we looked at this and I thought, wow, here are people doing fascinating kind of convening kind of work. Isn't this perhaps something that we need to do here in South Africa? And so we also gained some inspiration from people like Otto Schaumer, who is profiled in your book, Sandra, which I was interested to see, as well as people like Tima and so on. But also Adam Kahane, whom some of you might know and has written a lot of, I think, really interesting stuff on collaboration and social change. And Adam, at the time especially, spent time in Cape Town, and so we had networks that could pull him into some conversations. And so I'm not going to go into much more detail to explain how the lab was set up. Suffice to say that Theory U was a very important guiding framework. And so what we did is we basically went through a number of what we would call change lab processes, where we would start by inviting, in the language of Theory U and this kind of change lab literature, it's a strategic microcosm of the system. A few days ago, I was speaking with someone who referred to this kind of thing as a kind of a fractal of the system. So you create this group of people that are, have some degree of influence and exposure and knowledge about the system and could have a generative conversation with each other in trying to innovate and try to experiment and create positive change on the other side of the U. But the first, the kind of downward slope, as it were, of this U process was really getting them together, well, identifying a group, bringing them together, and that, of course, wasn't always a straightforward thing. And then a key thing that really was powerful was putting them in a bus, essentially, and just driving around, visiting this, key sites in the system, in person, being there in situ, trudging through the fields, seeing the avocado trees and seeing just how dried up they were because the irrigation systems weren't working, and speaking to the farmers, understanding their kind of day-to-day realities, speaking to the emerging farmers, the small scale, the very poor farmers, but then also speaking to these massive commercial operations that were often neighboring to these poor farmers, and trying to understand how is it possible that you have these two different worlds cheek by jowl like this. And then, what was often, it was the conversations in the bus, or perhaps the conversations in the bar in the evening after, kind of a hot day of driving around, that gave rise to ideas like things like this one, right? So the global gap is a general agricultural practices, a kind of a set of global practices, standards that really disadvantage small-scale farmers in the African context. And so one of the innovations that came out of one of these processes was to say, well, let's create a local version of that, and also then create a kind of a participatory guarantee scheme, or where there was like a peer review of adherence to these standards, rather than yet another layer of expensive consultants and standard enforcers and so on. So that was just one example of things that eventually would come out of this kind of process. Another example here is where we became a lot more embedded in particular places, because we realized to innovate and also see these innovations through, we would really have to create relationships that went beyond just a field visit or two. So this is a part of the country outside Durban, a very challenged environment for all a bunch of reasons: ecological, political, social. And this is an example of, helping these farmers develop and implement new farming practices. You can see these raised beds over there. And that is an example of something that really helped, especially in these massive floods that this part of the world experienced about 2 years ago, right? So that's just an example of the kinds of things that we try to do, and some of the things that came out of that process. And there's more information on the website. So those of you that are interested, there's also, some of my friends and colleagues, I think, have done a good job to tell some of these stories and to collate some of the materials over the years. So, I mean, we did publish a bunch of stuff based on that work, but mostly in development or journals like Ecology and Society, a journal called Environment that I'm involved with. So quite policy and practice oriented. We struggled, to be honest, to get things published in management for reasons that I think many of you will understand and appreciate. But early days and trying to do that involved titles like this, right? Which we're trying to understand the relationship between dialectic or dialogic agency, to trying to theorize what kind of change agency is enabled by, or kind of potentially involved in dialogue as a process, as a way of affecting social change. So some of you might know some of the work of Tom Lawrence, for example. He's written about institutional work, and dialogue sometimes features in that literature. So we try to be part of that conversation. We were part of Tom and Nelson Phillips' Egos Trek for a couple of years, so much so that I think they got sick of us after a few years. But it was very useful to have those conversations. Eventually, we realized, we struggled with some of the reviews of this early work. And so there was a special issue of strategic organization. Amanda Williams was one of the guest editors, Gail Whiteman as well. And they were, we realized we could switch the story around and actually explain, take the action research dimension of this work and foreground that a whole lot more. Whereas previously, we almost felt like we had to hide that a little bit, because action research does often invite some quite critical comments from many reviewers. In this spatial issue, we could actually put that front and center, right? So that's a little bit of the background of this particular paper. I'm going to go quite quickly through the kind of theoretical rationale of this paper. I think the key point here is that there's an extensive literature around this notion of convening stakeholders and the potential for multi-stakeholder dialogue, right? So many of you will know Silvia Dorado wrote about this already 20 or so years ago. Of course, there's this literature on cross-sector collaboration. People like Huxham and Wangen and Tom Lawrence wrote about that as well. And so more recently, people have talked about researchers becoming actively involved in such dialogue. And implicitly, they've described, in fact, convening such processes. So I think a really good example is Amanda Williams and Gail Whiteman in this paper where they talk about Arctic Base Camp, which is something that Gail Whiteman was very involved in setting up and convening. But they only really briefly mention that this is an opportunity to leverage academic skills, but don't really go into any detail. And they also explain that it's really very demanding, that takes a lot of time and resources. Sandra mentioned some of the risks that researchers might take in adopting such an approach to their day job. And so Barbara Gray's work has also been influential, and she's got an important article on the role of power in cross-sector interactions. And she, in that article, she and her colleagues really kind of warn us about the possibility of researchers becoming involved as facilitators or conveners, because essentially it's a fairly demanding task that we might not really be trained to do, and we don't have perhaps the kind of wherewithal, the background, and so on. So those were some of the things we read in the literature, and we thought, hang on, but we've been doing this now for 15 years, and maybe we should actually reflect on that experience in the context of these kind of conversations. In the literature, the question, therefore, what are affordances, what helps us do this kind of thing, but also what are some of the difficulties and tensions that arise when researchers try to do this kind of process, convening and facilitation. So I'm going to quickly go through our key answers to that question. The first set of arguments really has to do with the affordances. So what did we find if we reflected on the various interviews, but also our data that we collected over the 15 years? So that is all described in a lot more detail in the paper. I'm not going to bore you with that right now. Amanda really pushed us very hard to make this a kind of to bring rigor into explaining that we weren't just kind of sitting down and having a conversation about, well, what happened in the last 15 years, and let's write that up. She challenged us all the time to really bring data to the table to substantiate our arguments. But I'm not really going to talk about methods. We can talk about that if you are more interested later on. So in terms of affordances, we identified this thing that we call convening power, and we were perceived to have some degree of neutrality, which was important because this was such a contested or controversial issue. There was a lot of tension between NGOs, especially that were very critical of the large corporations, the food corporations. People were also very critical of government not doing things the way that they thought that it should be doing things. And in that context, there was, I don't think anybody had the illusion that we were objectively neutral, but relatively speaking, we were at least not as vested or associated with particular positions as some of the other actors in the system. So this is for example, when for a while I was the chair of the board, and I was quite keen to jump off that role. And there was a board member that said, no, actually, we need someone from the university to play that chairing role. We're not ready to let go of that. So that was a pretty important theme for a couple of years. The second affordance we identify is this what we call staying power, or staying ability, perhaps. I don't know if power is the right word that we use, but an ability to keep things going, because we weren't consultants that needed to pay for our hours or days. We had, academic jobs, and we also had access to some venues, sometimes in our universities, that we could use just to keep things going when we didn't have funding, which was quite often, right? So we would have a year or two worth of funding to run one of these change lab processes. And then quite often there was a 2 or 3 year hiatus before we could collect or kind of apply for and win some additional funding for a follow-on round or some new kind of process. In that hiatus period, we would then do things like have breakfast meetings just to keep people engaged, keep some of those relationships alive, keep them thinking about these issues, and so that we could then move forward quite quickly when funding was available. And that was really important because we identified this relationship between what we call propedeutic processes that were not obviously impactful, right? So we had a supporting smallholder farmers project or program in the early years of the food lab in 2010, 2011. And a lot of the participants were quite excited about it, and they said, yes, I've gained this and I've gained that. But at an institutional level, there wasn't really something that we could point to say, okay, this thing has really made a difference. So then in between that, after that process, there were 2 or so years where we didn't really have any funding, but we did have things like these breakfast meetings. We were able to apply for more funding and so on. And then the second kind of process was able to connect to that first one, build on those relationships and build on those kind of ways of thinking that had been developed in the first process, and was much more impactful. That's, I mentioned that example of local gap some moments ago. That was an outcome from that second process. I don't think it would have been possible if we hadn't had the earlier process, right? And so if we weren't able to bridge that gap in between these two processes, then I don't know how we could have created that more longer term benefit of the food lab's work. So let me move to the challenges and tensions, right? So the first challenge and tension was between our own and other people's perceptions and questions around whether our role as conveners was to be content experts, where we would say, okay, this is what the science says on, issue X or issue Y. So here's an example of a quote of a participant in one of the workshops that was really, quite forceful to say, we just need more objective facts here. We must stop talking subjectively. We must stop guessing about stuff. And there was a real challenge to us because, we were perceived as researchers as having to live up to that kind of expertise role. And then at the same time, there was also this expectation that should be as conveners, we should be custodians of process, which is not about expertise. It's about ensuring that diverse voices are respected and heard and brought into conversation with each other, right? So in this example here, there's a quote from a participant that really highlights their appreciation that different perspectives were brought around the table. It wasn't about saying, okay, perspective X is true and perspective Y is wrong. It was about saying, let's just understand each other's perspectives before we start judging and making decisions. So that was the first tension. The second tension had to do about the kind of change orientation that we would really advance as conveners. And a functional perspective, and I'm just using Parsons here let me use that word for this, emphasizes the need that this is a system that is doing important stuff, and if you mess around with it too much, then there's going to be a serious problem. So we need to have some degree of maintenance of the system. And so if there's going to be change, it has to be pretty careful, and it has to be incremental. Versus a radical view. So some of them are kind of radical NGOs said this system is fundamentally broken and we shouldn't be shoring it up we should, if it burns, let it burn, and then we create a new system, right? And that these perspectives were pretty staunch, and we found ourselves, let me speak for myself. I found myself kind of pulled and pushed and pulled between these perspectives quite a lot. So, I mean, ironically, we were accused of, by opposing camps all the time of being in the opposite camp. So here's a quote from a corporate manager who was, very, in his view, we were very negatively disposed towards companies. And then we would often get like the opposite criticism from some of the NGOs that kind of cynically was saying, kind of are saying that we're passionate advocates for supermarkets or the retail companies, large corporations. And so you can see how this kind of thing might play out if you're trying to convene a conversation. And so the way that we describe this, or in a picture in the paper, is by putting those two tensions into kind of a 2 by 2 diagram. Like an x-axis is the content process tension, and the y-axis here is the tension between radical change and functional innovation, as we've called it here. And so in each of those quadrants, you could imagine a particular kind of role definition, right? And or self-conception, right? So you could imagine that in the top left-hand corner, I might identify myself as a radical expert, which is about bringing knowledge to the table to really motivate and shape a radical change agenda. On the top right-hand side, I would still have that radical change agenda, but the primacy there is not about knowledge, expertise, but about facilitating a kind of process that would prioritize the voices of NGOs and poor farmers, for example, and perhaps even proactively diminishing the voices of large corporations. And then you can imagine the opposite kind of in the bottom two quadrants. So that and between each of those four role options, as it were, there was antagonism between them, since it was kind of an either-or situation. And it felt, I mean, for many, quite a few of these interactions, it just felt like, we had to choose between them, or we were being expected and pulled from one to the other. And so it was not always comfortable, to say the least. So the way we talk about that in the paper is to say that this was also a function of a particular perspective on dialogue, which we call a shallow dialogue, right? So there was in some ways an assumption that dialogue was about seeking consensus, and at the same time, in some ways paradoxically, about debating between different kinds of institutionalized roles. So, you would expect that the corporate manager would come to the table with a bunch of perspectives that would really try to show up, his institutionalized agenda as a manager in a corporation and so on. And then likewise, you would have the NGO activist really defending a certain kind of role. And then, so what we really, it wasn't really a very conscious process, but over the years, I think there was a shift. And it wasn't at all a very clear or decisive or categorical shift. I think there's lots of shades of gray and falling back and iteration in this process. But I think we realized that we couldn't exclude anybody. So there was a commitment to inclusion, but part of that was what we call radical inclusion, that is really foregrounding the need to strengthen voices of the marginalized. So that's what we call radical inclusion. And we developed this kind of a sense, let's say, of actor complexification, which means, people come to these, let's see them as whole persons, that there's no necessary coherence or rigidity in people's perspectives or roles. You can rock up one day and have a view X on a situation. The next day you might have changed your mind. And you also have different tendency, right? Maybe from your family background, you are a passionate organic farmer, but you happen to be working for Monsanto. And so, I mean, some of these contradictions happen within people, and we needed to understand that. And we saw that happening, right? And we saw the potentially generative value of bringing that complexity of individuals into these conversations. And so in the paper, we talk about this sense of deep dialogue, where instead of consensus seeking, it's about what Chantal Mouffe talks about as agonistic engagement, which is really to appreciate and the contrary perspectives and interests, not to sweep them under the table, but to agree to shared norms of dialogue and interaction with each other. So that's a key aspect of that point. And perhaps the most important one is this idea of intersubjective relating, which is about that whole person interaction and really avoiding the instrumentalization of the other, the partner in conversation. That is a subject in her his own right. So that's from Martin Buber's work, was very kind of inspiring for us on that count. And what that meant in terms of the tensions was that in some ways they really they didn't go away, but they diminished to some extent. I mean, on the process side of things, they did diminish because we had this notion of radical inclusion that basically meant we don't really have major challenges in terms of saying who should be part of this or who shouldn't, because we'd found a resolution to that. But there still was this tension between radical and functional change, but instead of having these fundamental tensions between them, we felt that, or at least I felt that there was a bit more fluidity and an ability to move between these possibilities. So I'll just give you two quick examples of that, how some of this manifested. And one of these moments was in a workshop at the end of the second supporting smallholder farmers dialogue process. And so Rebecca was one of the facilitators there, and we were basically trying to wrap this thing up. And she describes this, right? So that even though we were close to the end of the discussions, there was this constellation in the room where powerful actors, so these white men mostly from large companies, were really getting excited and saying, okay, this is what we're going to have to do, ABC. And then the other participants in the dialogue were, physically, not just structurally, but physically in the conversation, sidelined. And so I think it took a lot of courage for Rebecca to say, hang on, we need to point this out to people. So she described this, and she says, when we named that, it caused a lot of disturbance and anger. So I was there. I remember especially some of the white men that she was talking to and pointing this out to. They got pretty irritated. In fact, there were some angry emails sent afterwards and so on. But there was a very important shift here because it facilitated the kind of system, I think to some extent, a kind of a longer term shift in the system where there was more effort put into bringing leaders from among the Black emerging farmer group into leadership roles, both within their own networks, but also within the food labs activities. The other example I want to quickly mention was really, I think, an example of how the tensions between radical and functional change emerged, but then also were dealt with, right? So we had this launch event of a scenarios report, and it was actually quite funny looking back now after some years, because we invited this fairly well-known sociologist who we knew was going to be, critical, because she was a well-known critical voice in this field. But she really went beyond expectations, because she basically said this report is a bunch of rubbish because we were, giving way too much space to the perspectives of the corporations. And it was very antagonistic. What this one participant explained here is that something quite remarkable happened, right? So instead of this antagonism flowing over into a kind of a polarization, people, not just, I'm not talking about the conveners or the facilitators, but the participants, because of the process that we've been going through for a couple of months, and the quote, this person was quoted here, we know how to handle this kind of conversation. We know how to do this without polarizing. Let's take opportunity of this, pretty hot moment to stay engaged with each other and to kind of engage in a respectful way, even though you fundamentally disagree. So that was, I think, an example of this role fluidity and complexification in action. So let me conclude. I've gone over just 30 minutes, so let me finish here. With the conclusion to the paper, right? We say we identify these affordances, and they suggest that in some circumstances, and I think the context is important here. I don't know to what extent this kind of thing might be possible. For example, in a kind of competitive North American school, but can be desirable and powerful for researchers to help convene multi-stakeholder dialogue to address these complex social problems. At the same time, there are these these tensions that need to be dealt with, and these tensions, however, are less debilitating if we shift towards a more what we call a deep conception of dialogue that is not about consensus seeking or debate, but this notion of authentic intersubjective encounters, as a source of individual, organizational, institutional change. So that's the kind of key points of the paper. And so maybe I'll spend the next 2 or 3 minutes just to give that segue into this, some of the way in which I've been thinking about this more recently, which is connecting with some of the indigenous knowledge stuff, right? So in the paper, the way we also started thinking about this, as I mentioned, we had a bunch of work, prior versions of the paper that was really about dialogue as institutional work. The question here is, how do we change the world? And through dialogue in this instance. And what's really intriguing to me that even in the paper, and I only really thought about this quite recently in this way, it's about personal change, right? It really becomes a question that is more around self-work as a kind of a social symbolic work, as Nelson Phillips and Tom Lawrence would say. And the question there is, how do we change as we engage in the world? And perhaps even more fundamentally, and this is going to the realm of perhaps new age spiritualism, but like who am I? Like what is the self that I'm bringing to the table here, and how is my conception of the self changing as I engage with the world? And it's in that context where some of in the last 2 years or so, I've really gained a lot of inspiration, let's say, from indigenous knowledge, especially from the Amazon. And so you might ask, why is someone in Cape Town emphasizing Amazonian indigenous knowledge? And that is a little bit of a long story that I'm not going to go into right now, but we can perhaps in the Q&A if that is of interest. But one of the key shamans that has been visiting us regularly over the last few years is Nina Wapaidamata. He's a very kind of respected spiritual and kind of practical community leader in the province of Acre in Brazil, which is the far western parts of Brazil, quite close to the Peruvian border. So they part of what is known as the Huni Queen community, right? So they've been coming here over quite a few years already, and the things that these perspectives have really been highlighting for me, and I'm going to try to encapsulate it just in 2 ways for now that I think resonate with some of the lessons from the food lab, oddly enough, right? So the first is this sense of an expanding self-conception and an awareness of and beyond the egoic mind. And you probably appreciate that this is, of course, a very important notion in Buddhism as well. The Buddha spoke about this kind of thing, and people in modern day authors like Eckhart Tolle would highlight this kind of thing. And the way I'm summarizing it here is to really focus on these three aspects, which is this identification with mental rumination, ego enhancement, and projected appraisals, right? So it's kind of adapting terminology from identity theory, which is about my self-concept really being determined or identified with what I think other people see or think of me. The kind of engagement with Wow and some of the other shamans have really, in some ways, illustrated the possibility, at least, of diminishing that kind of egoic mind identification and slightly like a broader, self-concept. And the second aspect, I think many of you will know this from literature on indigenous knowledge, but there's a real, not just an intellectual, but a very embodied emotional sense of relating with reverence to others and to nature. And that, both of these together actually resonate really quite well in a quite surprising way for me with some of the things that we are saying in this paper about shifting towards deep dialogue based on, how do we define ourselves and how do we define the others that come into dialogue with us around some of these complex social problems. So that's basically the story for this afternoon or the morning for you guys. That's where I'll leave it, I think, and I'll stop sharing, I think. So, Sandra, in case there are some conversation questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. That was terrific. I particularly really appreciate the reflections on the indigenous wisdom, which I would say is not actually new age, it's ancient. And it comes from so many different traditions. So I know it's weird in our management kind of discipline to talk about that stuff, but it's sort of where we need to go if we want to move from sort of how do we shape our individual awareness to the broader picture. So I have a ton of questions, but I know there's a lot of questions in the audience. You can either I'll call on some folks who put questions in, but if you have a question or a comment you want to make, preferably fairly briefly, given the time, you can also raise your hand. Phil Mervis, I know you had a couple comments. Do you want to open us up?
Yeah, thank you very much. Great job, Ralph. Nice to see you. I'm wondering how you have changed through this process.
That's my question. Thank you, Phil. That was my question.
I'm channeling you.
So thanks. So Tanya, do you want me to, Sandra, do you want me to respond to that? No? Yeah. Do you mean the food lab process or do you mean engagement with the Huni Queen?
You personally.
Yes, but which of those two, or is it a combination that you?
Combination.
Okay. So the food lab has, I think, in some ways, quite implicitly and perhaps intuitively shifted the way I show up. If I'm trying to engage with others on controversial issues, I think it's basically softened my edges a whole lot. I mean, I still, struggle with, reactivity and all that. I'm definitely not gonna say that I'm like super calm and collected always in difficult conversations. I'm definitely not that, but I think it's gotten better because of the practice in the food lab. But the, kind of engagement with the Huni Queen have probably turbocharged changes that I would have never anticipated before. I mean, it's entirely different order of magnitude kind of change to sense of self. And I mean, for example, I would never have really and described myself as a spiritual person, but that interaction with the shamans has kind of really shifted my worldview. And I mean, if I may, go into even that, deeper levels, fundamentally, for example, relationship to death. And that has been very profound for me.
Catherine, LaRue, would you like to ask one or both of your questions?
I feel like I typed and made sense as I typed. I've got so many things to say. Firstly, let me start with thank you. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it. I have more questions, too many actually, but if I look at just my chat, let's go the first one. I wanted to know about what to do. I guess it's my practice background. I want to know now what to do. So you've identified that these tensions and these paradoxes, and you pulled in so many directions, and you need to find consensus, but how do you do it? So I'm asking, is it packaging? Is it framing? You got to show up, and you still have to deal with these different people. And I'm wondering if it's letting go of your certain beliefs and letting go of having hard. Do you convince people to let go of tightly held beliefs and be more loosely, and we're willing to adjust? I'm not sure what to do, and it's more a practical question. As you said, that you hope to have this in a practical sense, the practical sense maker. What now? Because you've fleshed them out. I love them, but I'm just wondering, how do you get this consensus? Is it a packaging framing? My sense making's asking these questions.
So I mean, I want to be really careful. I think it's so difficult to deal with polarized situations. I mean, I had a class yesterday, and I was struggling, to be honest, with this pretty hardcore climate skeptic, and then there was he was teaming up with a cynic who didn't really care about any of the stuff we were talking about, and I was feeling myself triggered, and so it's really is very hard. I'm not at all gonna pretend that I have either intellectual or methodological answers to those questions, but I think we can also draw some inspiration from some of the literature that we have tried to use, not in a great depth, but I think there's some starting points. And so Chantal Mouffe is kind of at the more political level, and it really encourages us to see tensions between political perspectives and interests not as something to shy away from. In fact, she says there's a problem when it seems like people are agreeing. There's this famous phrase in her work, which is any consensus actually hides some hidden power imposition, or a kind of a hidden hegemony. And so we need to, I suppose, in some ways, just accept and also perhaps even sometimes surface different perspectives and tensions, rather than have them kind of act out in ways in other forums or other places, because they don't go away. So Chantal Mouffe talks about these passions that people have. She gives attention to this as emotional energies rather than just intellectual perspectives. And these passions need space to manifest and express themselves, even even if it's super uncomfortable for someone like me who totally disagrees with that perspective, right? So some kind of let's say, well, I'm not going to mention any names or perspectives right now. Let's not complicate things. And that's at the political level. And Martin Buber is really helping us to then consider that at the interpersonal level, to really practice this. And it is a practice. It's not something that can just be switched on and off. To practice this muscle of always seeing the person as something very complex and multifaceted, and the expressions that they might bring into an interaction are, a consequence of their context, the day they've had, the stuff that they've been reading online, and yes, we need to engage with those perspectives, but also understand that there's only in a religious kind of language, we would almost say something like recognize their soul rather than just their ego perspective. And if we do that, and that would be from religious language, but I think Martin Buber has a different kind of language there that says that there's subjectivity. Really respect their subjectivity in ways where we don't react only to that intellectual perspective that they bring. We try to find that bigger view of their personhood, and also bring respect for that personhood. Never mind how objectionable their intellectual perspective or argument might be, right? So I think, and it is super hard, but there's a practice that can help that, right? And I mean, I've been lucky to meet, for example, some spiritual teachers that are just remarkably powerful at that, and it changes the tone of the conversation immediately because of the depth of their own presence in that moment. And it's not something that I can do at all to that level, but I've seen it, right? I mean, it's quite remarkable that the presence that they can bring into a situation really changes that tone entirely. And to some extent, it even happened in the classroom yesterday where I had some guest speakers, and it changed the tone quite significantly, partly because of a bunch of factors, but I think part of it was bringing a relationality into the room. There was a kind of a reconstellating.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's that relationality that is so core to the shamanic kind of practice, understanding the relationality. There's so many great questions. Jonathan, you want to ask your question? And then we'll go to Julia after you, but let Ralph answer first. Jonathan, are you there?
Hi there. Hi, thank you very much, Ralph. Absolutely fascinating and inspiring in lots of ways. But I was just wondering about you set out to try to reduce food insecurity. Did you? But in the talk, you took us into something of your personal journey and your role in an engagement with a bunch of people. Very interesting. What happened to the food security situation? Is it any better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's a big problem, as you know, and with a lot of facets. And so, I would be cautious to say, okay, here's an initiative, and we will now measure the success or otherwise of that initiative by having some objective indicators of whether or not, households in some or other part of the country have better access to food. There's so many other things involved, and many of them are on, for example, whether someone in America decides to impose new tariffs or not, right? So these are it's such a complex system that I would be quite cautious to try to measure impact across all these levels of interdependencies and so on. So there's more the intermediate outcomes of the process that were important for us, which we call these kind of proto-institutional outcomes, which we could measure and which we talk about in the paper. One example is this standard that enabled small-scale farmers to access formal supply chains. We worked with retailers so that they developed systems, and it goes down to sometimes quite technical supply chain stuff, right? So we went and explored what was going on in the distribution centers of these big retailers, and they are incredibly sophisticated and every centimeter of a large warehouse is being allocated, and every second, in fact, during a day is being allocated to certain kind of very tight plans and actions, and then you come that's the corporate sector, right? The formal sector, and then you have these low-income farmers that have to borrow some kind of pickup that you know they really struggle to make it on time. They can't make it onto the platform, the ramp to then to take off the produce into that distribution center. So it's that kind of detail where we then try to work with retailers to say, how can we improve access? So that wasn't specifically to enhance access to food in poor households. That was focused more on the smallholder farmer space, which we saw as being part of the bigger picture of food security, right? And then just very briefly, another example was more at the national level where we said, at the moment, food security, this was about 15 years ago, food security is an issue that is thematically allocated to a small office in the Department of Agriculture. And we saw that as a fundamental problem from a public policy and national, kind of resource allocation point of view. And so we had this process called the food scenarios process, and that played a role, among other things, to bring food security into the presidency, the very center of government, right? At least for a while. Unfortunately, there was then some shifts in policy and personnel, but for a while, we had really brought food as an issue into the very center and the most powerful center of government. And that was, kind of an outcome that we felt was a success. Did that then translate into very tangible outcomes? We're not sure. Finally, at the very local level, some of our initiatives, we can measure impact on poor people on the ground. So the initiative that I showed you, that photo with that farming, those raised beds, we actually are working with public health researchers who are, for example, studying the outcomes of nutrition outcomes at the household level, linking that for also with health outcomes in terms of HIV/AIDS and things like that. And there we do see some tangible benefits of that intervention at the household level.
Thanks, Ralph. So Julia, you want to ask your question quite quickly, and Ralph, we have only 2 minutes left, so just framing it. Julia, where'd she go? Did she leave? Is Julia not here? Joe Rees, you had a couple of questions.
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering if I teach creativity and we use the process of design thinking. Are you aware of any design thinking prototyping experiments going on around these kinds of challenges?
So we have one of the D schools, the Hasso-Plattner D schools, that was actually in our school for a while, and now it's become independent as part of our university. So we have a fairly strong design kind of community in our local network here. But quite apart from that, some aspects of design thinking or design process is what did sometimes come up on the third part of the U when we move into prototyping, experimenting, right? So we adopt some of that language, I mean, as you can tell from prototyping and so on, where we would have teams of people, ideally from different parts of the system, saying, what can we do differently? For example, in terms of the rules that govern access to formal supply chains, or the packaging of food. At one point, we had a team focusing on that, and so they would then come up with ideas that we would then prototype, and we wouldn't use that language. Okay, this is our design thinking process, or we wouldn't use some of those tools or artifacts. But the essential aspect of prototyping and testing and then trying to expand, that was an important part on the latter parts of the Change Lab process.
Thank you, Ralph. I just want to say thank you to everyone. Happy holidays. Stay tuned, because in the early part of next year, we're going to actually delve into some of the actual shamanic practices based on a connection that Ralph has made for me. So I think it will advance this conversation even further. Ralph, this was terrific. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. And everybody have a great holiday season, summer, winter, wherever you might be.
Thanks so much, Sandra. It was a great session.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed that.